With Hamish, no lie is ever too big. This is the biggest con man in Australian history.
Hamish scammed in excess of $60 million.
When we think about what motivates somebody like Hamish, it boils down to greed. He just wants money.
It wouldn't matter if the victim had $5 or $5 million, he just wanted what you had.
With Hamish's victims, everything starts off fantastic. You're best friends, you feel like you're onto a winner.
I met Hamish online on a dating app. Charismatic, intelligent, funny.
Very friendly.
A little bit flash.
He made you feel special.
Hamish used different professions, he changed his name, he changed his look.
I believed he was telling me the truth and I had no reason to think otherwise.
He used to always say, "Your family. I'm not going to let you end up with nothing."
Within 2 weeks, the money was in my account, but it didn't stay in my account very long. It wasn't there a day.
It was millions and millions of dollars just moving around over these pages.
This wasn't just simple theft. He embedded himself in people's lives and then blew them up.
See you on the other side.
He was lying in a bed next to me, pretending to love me, and in his head, he is plotting to destroy me.
He stopped answering his phone completely. Then it all started to get really scary.
He's a very cruel man. Very sick man, I think.
Everybody that Hamish came across was a potential target. They didn't realise that they were standing face to face with a potential psychopath.
I had no idea what was real and what was not. I was like, who the fuck is Hamish?
See you on the other side.
Hamish was a con man of the highest order. He ripped people off over an almost 30-year career all around the world. This wasn't just about theft for Hamish. He embedded himself in people's family or their friendship circle and then would just demolish their lives in the process.
I had been separated from my husband for over a year. I was getting used to being a single mum, working hard, and I was looking to meet someone and potentially start a relationship. I came across a profile of a man by the name of Max on a dating app. He said he worked in banking, and there were a series of photos of him. There was no description. It was just Max, 41.
Tracy Hall, very much the picture of a successful Sydney businesswoman. She wasn't wanting to rush into anything. She had her guard up, certainly, when she encountered Max, as Hamish was positioning himself.
The first date that Hamish and I went on, he was very attentive, listened, asked questions. He was very interested in what was going on for me, and there was never really any awkward silences or anything like that. So when you first meet someone, that's always a really good sign, I think. And we had a really good laugh.
So I met Hamish through a very good friend who had investments with him. My first impression of Hamish was that he was very charming and he was very professional, head to toe in a Tom Ford suit. I thought he was the real deal.
As is the way with a lot of Hamish's victims, Hamish was actually introduced to Karen by a friend, and this friend talked him up, and that immediately gained some trust.
He told me that he had his own investment company and that he was a broker. First of all, I'll never forget this. He walked into my kitchen and went, wow. And that has always stayed with me because he was really impressed with the house. He was really, really interested to know if I had a mortgage and how much I'd paid for the house. He took many phone calls while he was on the first visit and talked openly about deals and trades. He sounded like he was a very busy man, actually.
We actually met Hamish through our eldest granddaughter. You know, he's always jovial, could speak to people about anything and everything.
Lorraine and Peter, really sweet, retired couple, such dedicated grandparents. Two of their grandchildren were born with disabilities. One died very early in their life, another died as a teenager. They took on a lot of parenting responsibilities. It was really clear that they found it really important to support their family however they could.
2004, Peter had an accident at work.
I was involved in a truck rollover and lost the memory and 3 bleeds to the brain.
I can always remember the neurosurgeon saying to me, forget the man you married because he's a different person altogether. And he was and still is. We had 4 years of trying to survive and then Pete got a good payout. He would have known that Peter's memory wasn't as good, and I think that's where it started to go downhill.
Yeah, he saw me as an easy target. And as soon as he sees something like that, he's just straight on.
Everybody that Hamish came across from his perspective was a potential target. He saw them as an opportunity to exploit, whereas from their perspective, they didn't realize that they were standing face to face with a potential psychopath.
Hamish was born on the 29th of March, 1970. He attends a private school called Pittwater House on Sydney's Northern Beaches. This is a pretty quiet, family-oriented, beach-focused part of Australia. The people who were friends with him when he was a teenager all said that he was a pretty nice, well-to-do guy, liked hanging out with his friends, had a bit of a fractured relationship with his father. He always felt that his dad didn't approve of him. He finished school in Year 10, he didn't complete Year 12. We do know that he moved out of home. He said at the time that it was because of a falling out with his father. After school in the 1980s, Hamish was a ski instructor at Silver Star, which is a ski hill in Canada. It's difficult to identify the exact starting point when Hamish's con began, but we know it goes back a long time. Hamish got his start in the finance industry in the 1990s as a trainee, share trading on the Sydney Futures Exchange.
So my first recollection of Hamish was there's multiple flash, fancy, very expensive cars, but certain stories didn't make sense.
Joe Cross was one of the people who encountered Hamish early on in his career as a trader. Joe's company covered people's trades, and when it came time to pay up, there was something called a margin call. Hamish had a margin call for $400,000. He needed to get Joe the money by close of business on a Wednesday. By Friday night, Hamish still hadn't paid up. Joe was threatening to shut down the account first thing Monday morning.
I get this phone call on Saturday night. The fella downstairs said, listen, there's a visitor here for you, Joe. His name's Hamish. Hamish Watson's his name. I opened the door and said, what's going on? He was carrying a garbage bag. He said, I told you I'd give you the money. Well, here it is. It was just under $400,000 in cash. And no one had ever paid me a margin call in cash. And he opened up his jacket and he showed me a handgun. The only place I've ever seen money like that was at the racetrack. The bookies had a lot of cash. Obviously, criminals had a lot of cash. So I have no idea where he got it from.
One of the first forays for Hamish into larger scale crime came in the late 1990s when he stopped being a trader and started what he called a fund with one of his friends.
Initially, when I first met Hamish, he was Hamish Watson. That's, you know, the only name I was ever aware of. He would maintain eye contact, he would lean in, he would shake your hand, and he would actually make you feel very special.
This is an important moment in Hamish's career, for want of a better word. This is where he's completely given up any kind of legitimate trading in a market and he's just going full on with a con. They were looking around for people to invest in this fund, and so the first place he went looking was family and friends. Unfortunately for them, it didn't end well.
The figures that were sort of bandied about with regard to what the fund would return was sort of, you know, from memory, 10 to 12% a month, and obviously compounding. I invested approximately $220,000. You know, I was thinking that, you know, I'd almost be able to live on what I was going to get back.
Hamish was reporting fantastic returns in this fund, so Dominic naturally decided to cash out. This is always where it gets complicated with Hamish.
He was telling me dates as to when I'd be paid some money, which was sort of moving around, and I remember getting a bit frustrated thinking, you know, what's the big deal here? I want to take some money out. But, you know, rather than a finite date where money would be transferred into your account, it was sort of shifting.
It all came to a head with an unwelcome call from a friend who knew all the players.
The way I found out that everything with regard to Hamish was not as it seemed was when I got the phone call from my friend telling me basically that things were not as they seemed, and it looked like Hamish was a con man. I initially panicked. I remember just feeling sick in the pit of my stomach. Obviously, immediate terror, because all I could think of was whether I was going to get my money back.
It was one of Hamish's earliest cons, and Dom was lucky that he had some powerful friends in his corner who would go into bat for him and help him get his money back.
Who knows whether or not Hamish just said, yeah, give him his money back. I don't know, but I got my money back. I would think, once you're outed, you would go, hey, I think it's time to change my vocation. Hamish just pretty much, I think he dyed his hair colour, right? Lost a ton of weight, moved to Bondi and picked up where he left off because that was his MO. And so he was able to start and do what he did all over again. There would be people around the world who Hamish has affected, and they would be in the hundreds. They would be in the hundreds, yep, for sure.
Hamish's business partner, they allege Hamish had stolen $11 million from this fund, this scam. He spent a lot of time, energy and money chasing Hamish through the courts to no avail. There was no consequences for Hamish. He was able to slip the net, leave the country, go on offending elsewhere. Over the years, Hamish had some pretty big scores. There are allegations that Hamish was able to rip off a well-established family in regional Australia for $7 million, a case in Canada for $2 million. There's even a group in Hong Kong that says that he took $6 million. And he's suddenly starting to present himself as someone who knows Tom Cruise, who was hiring private jets, was buying his friends skidoos and jet skis, host lavish parties in Canada and America and England. Those trappings also gave the illusion of someone who was successful and that he was making lots of money.
He started off doing those corporate frauds, but he moved away from that type of investment scam. He started to target individuals, which were an easier mark for him. So he moved from individual to individual, and that became his modus operandi.
So if we break down the features of a good, skillful con artist, they tend to be quite intuitive. So they're good at reading people, good at finding those vulnerabilities quickly. They also tend to be quite charismatic. Con artists generally tend to be very good listeners, but of course there's also devious tactics behind this. A con artist is also trying to find out how much money an individual has, how potentially susceptible or gullible they might be.
Pete and I and a couple of friends were going out for a meal, and they happened to be in the same restaurant, and that was the first night that we actually met Hamish.
So at the time, Hamish was married, and his teenage stepson was dating Peter and Lorraine Cross's granddaughter. That connection through their granddaughter was all Hamish would have needed to identify them as very vulnerable. Hamish knew about Peter's brain injury, and he knew that as a result, he'd received a pretty generous compensation payout. So what appeared to be a coincidental meeting in a restaurant was actually a carefully and meticulously planned out beginning of the con.
To me, it almost feels like an animal stalking its prey. So he did a lot of background research. He knew facts about them. He knew that they were financially vulnerable.
He just said, "Oh, I think I've got something you really could be interested in." But he didn't actually go into it at that stage. He said, "Oh, and if it's okay, I can come round and see you." So it was about a week later that he did.
And for Lorraine and Peter, that was their first and fatal mistake.
I can remember him coming up the stairs and he stopped and he looked around. He says, "Wow, this is a nice house." And I just didn't take much notice of it. And then he came over and sat down and he started telling us about some deal with buying shares for 20 cents, but they were actually worth $1, which means you were making a lot of money.
He was very wary of being around people who had a better understanding or could kind of sniff out things. And I think it was pretty clever at just weaseling his way into relationships where he knew they weren't going to be able to outsmart him or detect what he was doing.
Well, we didn't have a great deal of money actually in the bank as that we could just get our hands on, so we decided to use a loan that we had that I hadn't actually cancelled out from when he had his accident. About $150,000, so that's what we decided to do.
Tracy had just started dating Hamish, who she believed was a 41-year-old banker called Max Tavita. Hamish had just begun working on her.
We went on a lot of dates before things got serious or intimate. We liked doing the same things. We enjoyed being outside, we enjoyed exercising, we enjoyed being in the ocean.
In psychiatric terms, this is called mirroring. If you can connect with somebody, if you can make them feel that they're on the same wavelength as you, perhaps you have the same kind of interests and hobbies and opinions, then they're more likely to connect with you.
As we spent more and more time together, that became obvious that we just really enjoyed each other's company. Over time, we grew closer and closer, and yeah, I grew feelings for him.
If somebody seems very similar to you, you're more likely to be open and susceptible to believing anything they tell you.
He essentially became what he knew I would be attracted to, so that I would respect him, fall in love with him, and want to continue to be with him.
When Karen met Hamish, he was calling himself Hamish McLaren. She was newly divorced and she had no money to fix the roof that was leaking. Now, Hamish is brilliant at reading people, and so he knew immediately that Karen was desperate.
He just kept telling me not to worry, I can help you. I know I can help you. So you mustn't worry anymore. We're going to fix the roof. You're going to be okay. He asked me, how much I needed. That I think I need about $200,000. And he said, well, I think you probably need more than that.
Karen also had a house guest from England staying at the time. He actually witnessed the first meeting between Karen and Hamish.
All of a sudden, this fellow with bright bleach blonde hair turned up, was about 40-odd, looked ridiculous, and sailed into the kitchen and just started working on his computer. He was very keen to tell us, he worked for Goldman Sachs and that he worked all over the world for them, globally, had use of Goldman Sachs jet.
So Hamish knew exactly how to pitch something. And why would they question it when he's a professional trader, he's living the high life, his scam looks so legitimate?
Yeah, after he left that day, I then called my friend and she said, I've told him how desperate you are and he will help you. When he came back a couple of days later, he almost went, right, I can get you $1 million. And I said, I don't need $1 million. He said, well, I hate the banks, so we're going to take $1 million and I'm going to make that money work for you. I said, the loan repayments on $1 million is a lot of money. He said, no, you don't have to worry about the loan repayments. Container 8 will take care of that. And that's a company that he traded under the name of. And he said Container 8 will take care of those payments. It will all come out of the fund.
Hamish had the ability to adapt his scams depending on the victim. In some cases, the scams would draw out over a long period of time. In other cases, it was quite short.
He came back about 5 days later. He said, I can get you this money and you just need to sign these forms. Within 2 weeks, the money was in my account from the first day I met him. But it didn't stay in my account very long. It wasn't there a day.
Karen's story is very typical of what happened with Hamish's victims. Everything starts off fantastic. You're best friends, he's giving you great financial advice, he's really going to set you up, you feel like you're onto a winner. Within days, she had this loan. She used the $200,000 to fix up her house. Hamish took the extra $800,000 out of her bank account and said, I'll invest it for you. Don't worry, it's going to be fantastic. And I'll keep repaying your mortgage so that you can stay here. Hamish had siphoned off almost $1 million from Karen's bank accounts, but he was looking for his next scam. He followed Karen and Henry to England. It opened up a whole world of rich pickings.
Within a week of being in England, there was a race meeting in Newmarket, and he met a couple of guys there, and by the end of the day, he'd secured himself an apartment in Belgravia in London, where he never paid the rent, and he also leased a Range Rover, and he never paid the lease on that, and then he just tried to get into everyone's pockets over there.
I introduced him to friends of mine that worked in the city, to friends of mine that work in property and real estate, he would go there already being faultlessly researched on them as individuals, their company, what they do, so that when he got there, he could be exactly the person that they wanted him to be.
Hamish was keeping all of his connections in London warm, particularly anyone with access to millions of dollars or in that high money set in London. Evan is a financial consultant in London, and he was asked to check out Hamish for a friend who Hamish was sniffing around.
We knew him in London as Hamish Maxwell. He said he was doing high-frequency trading for Goldman Sachs. I told him that I know a lot of people in this specific department at Goldman Sachs who would surely know him if he'd ever had any affiliation with Goldman Sachs. And at that moment, he started perspiring and excused himself, and he said he needed to leave to get to his next meeting. He realized, to his credit, frankly, that he couldn't sit there for another minute without getting caught in a lie.
Only days after running away from that meeting, it emerged that Hamish had been telling some very tall tales about his financial wizardry.
He had made $75 billion in a single year. In fact, he was talking about numbers that exceeded the entire profitability of the entire US banking sector. So the numbers just didn't make any sense. So he was relying on people just not checking or not comprehending the scale of those numbers. Obviously, did not stand up to scrutiny.
With Hamish, no lie is ever too big. And if one doesn't work, he just tries the next one. For Tracy, things with Max were going really well. And over time, he started to reveal more about his past. But unfortunately, none of it was real.
So one of our first dates, we had agreed to go up to Palm Beach for the day. Then we decided to walk up to the lighthouse. You know, as we're up there and we're sitting on a rock and looking out at the view, he dropped into conversation that he would one day like to get married up the top of Barrenjoey Headland at the lighthouse. And he said, I feel happy here because this is where my parents' ashes are scattered. And he had told me very early on that his parents had died in a plane crash when he was 6. If he ever got married, that's where he'd want to get married because he'd want his parents to be there with him. I think it was a way for him to make me feel closer to him. I don't know, I guess I'll never know that.
He's invented incredible and terrible fantastical stories about his family. A twin brother that Hamish ran over in the driveway of the house and killed him at the age of 9. His mother had an affair and his dad murdered the person that his mum was having an affair with. There's just violent, terrible fractures in his childhood were things that he came back to. I think that there is something inherently broken in there with Hamish, that he can't relate to people.
Hamish told me he was the chief investment officer for a family office in the city, managing money on behalf of wealthy families, so he made all of the investment decisions surrounding those funds. He'd toddle off to work on a Monday morning or would go into the city together and he'd have his Tom Ford suit on and he'd be ready to go do his day of, investment banking. I believed he was going into the office. He was running a team of people. He had analysts. He had a boss that he spoke about a lot, Anna. He told me in which street the office was located in. He sent me photos from that office. He spoke at length about people in the office, what they ate for lunch, what they spoke about, what investments were happening, where they went for drinks after work. I took it on face value. I believed he was telling me the truth and I had no reason to think otherwise.
Hamish clearly didn't have empathy for his victims, but he was actually very good at giving the impression that he cared. Hamish was very much in the lives of his victims. He would socialise with them, he would spend time with their families. He was even doing this after the scams had started and whilst they were going on. So I think he has a lack of compassion. He is quite cunning and he is manipulative. But it also shows to me that he has a high level of confidence in his own ability to pull off the scams.
Hamish used to invite us down and we would stay with him in Sydney. We'd go out to good restaurants, beautiful meals, wine and all this sort of thing. We ended up becoming very close friends and enjoying each other's company. Each time that we went down, he was to show us what was going on with our investments, etc. That was a quick little thing on the computer.
He knew exactly what documentation looks like. And because of his experience, he was able to lay that out in a very professional way. The documentation looks legitimate. Obviously, there's a lot of trust in him. They had no experience with dealing with criminals.
He invited us around to his place and he just said to us that we were up to $3 million just off our $150,000. And I was a bit dumbfounded and looked at him and said, oh, really?
Hamish never went for it all at once with his victims. With Peter and Lorraine, having earned their trust, he asked for more. He convinced them to give him their retirement savings, their superannuation, the nest egg that was supposed to set them up for the rest of their life.
We thought, well, we might as well pull out our money out of our MLC super and give it to him and do better with it. I think from memory about $1,500,000 or something.
He knew exactly what he was doing and it netted him a massive payday.
Most of my friends are in racing back in England. Around May, June, there's a lot of horse race meetings and he got himself along to a few of those. Then there was Royal Ascot and he hired his top hat and came to the races and then sort of became one of the lads. At that race meeting, he got himself invited onto the private jet to holiday with the boys.
After Royal Ascot, he had been invited by friends of mine on a jet to Ibiza. I went on the trip as well. He spent the 4 days with us at a friend of mine's house. All of a sudden, he said he'd lost all of his credit cards, left them at home. So I had to lend him the money while he was there. He would disappear on those trips for a lot of the day. And he would stay back at the villa while we all went out for lunch. He would stay back at the villa, apparently working. Why would he come on a trip like this if he had to work all the time? Nothing really, none of the dots connected.
After the trip to Ibiza, the cracks were really starting to show.
When I'd come back from Ibiza, I just said to Karen, you need your money back. This guy is not straightforward. He just tells massive lies. He says he's got all this money, all these cars, yet he can't find 500 quid to bring on holiday to Ibiza. I said, if he can't get money like that, Karen, you've got no chance with your money.
And that completely threw me into a spin. I said, what do you mean? He said, he's just not who he says he is. He said just things that don't add up. He said, you need to get your money.
At this stage, Karen was getting really concerned that Hamish wasn't who he said he was. And meanwhile, Tom Zadrovic, an officer with the New South Wales Police Force, was handed a complicated case.
At the time of the Hamish investigation, I was a detective senior constable working out of Northern Beaches Detective's office. The investigation started after one of the victims reported the matter through to the police. My supervising sergeant had received the job. The initial view was that, at first glance maybe, it could be perceived as being an investment gone wrong and now an attempt to recoup that money and something that we couldn't be able to prove in the long term. When the financial crime stuff comes in, you need to be patient and be willing to kind of invest the time because it's a lot of work. I just don't want to give it up. I hate just going, yeah, sure, we'll just let this go. Like, unless I'm 100% certain, I don't like letting it go. The big motivator was the amount of money the initial victim lost, which was in the hundreds of thousands. I knew that there was something wrong.
Only 5 months after first meeting Hamish in her own kitchen, it was starting to dawn on Karen that Hamish wasn't what he'd put himself up to be. The mortgage repayments that he'd promised had stopped, and Karen was having to chase him every month for money.
So every month I had to find around $6,000 to pay the loan. And we went through a phase of having to pick up money in envelopes from him. I said to Hamish, I cannot go on like this. He said, well, you come into the city, just got to stop at the office and I'll get you some cash.
And that was one of the last times Karen ever saw Hamish.
That's when the money started drying up, and then every month was like Groundhog Day, trying to find the repayment. Then it all started to get really scary.
One of the victims reported the matter through to the police. The name that they had given was Hamish McLaren. When I started to look him up on the police systems, there was a couple of different identities in there, and they were all associated with some form of fraud or theft. The victim had provided a copy of his bank account, so that was the first kind of thing that we started to look at. I put out a blanket request to the major banks to identify anything that could be remotely linked back to Hamish McLaren. I came back to find a ream and a half of paper on my desk for bank statements. It was like an overwhelming feeling, I think. It was like looking at a lot of stuff there that I'm going to have to do. At the same time, it was exciting because I felt like I was onto something.
Karen owed the bank over $1 million. She was desperately trying to get Hamish to stick to the plan that he'd proposed to her, where he would give her $6,000 a month to cover the mortgage. But the mortgage payments had stopped. So it seemed like Hamish was running a short con on Karen. Within months, she'd stopped hearing from him altogether.
The loan didn't get paid 1 month. There was a letter as well to say that you are in breach of the loan agreement. I felt sick. I didn't sleep a lot. And then he went through a couple of months of pretending to be in Singapore, and he was in Bondi surfing.
Hamish had stopped paying the repayments on the $1 million he'd borrowed in Karen's name and then moved into his own account.
I used to drive around Bondi looking for him. And then one day, a girlfriend of mine in Bondi saw him, and she sent me a photograph of him in the butcher's shop. And I went to the butcher's shop and said, do you know blonde Hamish who surfs? And he went, yes. Have you seen him recently? And they said, yes, he was in the other day. Around about that time, he stopped answering his phone completely. Once I realised that I probably was in trouble, it became just every living minute I was trying to figure out what I was going to do.
When Hamish found someone with access to money, he kept going back again and again until they were out. And that's what he did with Peter and Lorraine. He'd already tapped them for $1.65 million. Hamish had an intimate understanding of all of Peter and Lorraine's finances. In particular, he was aware of an untapped line of credit on a loan that they hadn't accessed yet.
He actually one day rang me up and he said he knew there was about 360, I think, left in that loan, the thing that we had.
Hamish knew exactly how to get them to hand him the money. He promised them fantastic returns on a short-term investment.
And he said, I've got onto something really good and it's only going to be short time. And he said, and I'll have your money back to you. And I said, yeah, sure. So I was going to give him the lot. And he said, no, you keep 60 and the 300 will be fine.
When we look at the specific tactics that a con artist use, one of the things is they'll create this time pressure. You know, it's a really good investment, but you have to invest now. Because they know that if there is this time pressure, then the victim is less likely to think through the risks logically.
He used to always say, your family, you know, you're like a big sister to me. I'm not going to let you end up with nothing.
He'd gotten them to hand over all of their super, more than $1.5 million, and then convinced them to borrow more against the loans they'd already had. The repayments that he said that he was going to keep paying stopped coming.
That's when we got into trouble as far as money, because that $150,000 that we borrowed maxed out to nearly $730,000 because it wasn't being paid off, which he started doing, but then eventually he stopped.
But somehow Hamish managed to convince Peter and Lorraine that it was all going to be okay.
He said, don't worry about it. You'll have your money by the 14th of June, I think it was.
He kept saying the money's coming, we just got to wait for it to mature, and so I just sat back, give him the benefit of the doubt and let Lorraine deal with him.
I started doing my own checks on businesses he was affiliated with. The businesses didn't appear legitimate in any sense. He used different business entities, so Burlington Prudential was one, Container 8, Oceana Financial Markets, I think. He used those business names and then derivatives of his own identity to make it difficult to tie these stories together. You know, unless you're looking to tie them together, they won't naturally do it. I spent all day looking at bank statements, and the amount of money that you can see moving between people and the deposits he's receiving and the payments that he's making, it was millions and millions and millions of dollars just moving around over these pages. It's the type of money that I hadn't seen before.
The conversations we had around personal money were scattered throughout all of the other conversations, specifically around trades he was doing and, you know, funds he was investing in, what the markets were doing, those kind of things. Never once did he say, how much money do you earn, or how much have you got in superannuation, or how much savings do you have? Like, there was never anything like that.
The con that Hamish used against Tracy was a long game. So for this to work, it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of time. He didn't even ask about her money until they'd known each other for about a year.
Over the months and almost a year, he had so many of these conversations with me that when he said, why don't you set up your own self-managed super? And I said, well, you know, I wouldn't know how to do that. I don't know, you know, and of course, you know, there's Hamish that says, I can help you with that.
The con artists, or good con artists, use the soft sell rather than hard sell. They don't try and push their agenda too much, because if they can lay a trap, if they put some bait, and the victim comes towards that and makes them think that it's an idea they want to invest in, it's much more likely to work.
I didn't suspect anything, and to me it all seemed 100% legitimate.
It was all about speed. The longer I left him out in the world, the more he would just steal.
I rang him incessantly. I had shingles, my hair fell out.
What he did was just despicable. I actually think that he was grooming her from about 15, 16.
That's when the world came crashing down.